It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that usually passes without leaving any memory behind. The kind of slow weekday moment when a quick stop at the pharmacy is supposed to be the simplest errand on your list, because all I needed to do was pick up a prescription my doctor had sent earlier that morning, drive home, and spend the rest of the day resting. Yet by the time I walked out of that store nearly 40 minutes later, the entire situation had somehow spiraled into flashing police lights, confused employees, and a stranger loudly insisting that I had committed some kind of offense simply by sitting in a chair that the store itself had clearly placed there for customers who were waiting, which was exactly what I had been doing from the beginning. The pharmacy was located inside a medium-sized neighborhood drugstore that had been there for years. The kind of place where everything felt familiar from the moment you walked through the doors, because the aisles were always arranged the same way, and the lighting never seemed to change. And when I stepped into the pharmacy section that afternoon, the scene looked exactly like it always did, with a couple of customers waiting quietly near the counter, a pharmacist working behind the glass window while counting pills into small orange bottles, and 3 simple plastic chairs positioned along the wall near a blood pressure machine so people could sit down while their prescriptions were being prepared. After waiting in line for a few minutes, I reached the counter and gave the technician my name and date of birth, watching her type the information into the computer before she gave me a polite but slightly apologetic smile and explained that the prescription had come through from my doctor, but the pharmacist still needed to finish preparing it, adding that it would probably take around 20 minutes before it was ready, which honestly didn't bother me, because anyone who has ever used a pharmacy knows that waiting for medication is a completely normal part of the process. I thanked her, stepped away from the counter, and glanced around the waiting area before noticing that one of the chairs against the wall was empty. So I walked over and sat down, stretching my legs slightly after standing in line and pulling out my phone to check a few emails, while the quiet routine of the pharmacy continued around me, because there is something oddly peaceful about those slow moments in public places, where everyone is minding their own business and nothing unusual is happening. For several minutes, the scene remained exactly that calm, with the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional sound of a name being called when someone's prescription was ready. And I barely noticed the moment when a woman walked into the pharmacy section pushing a shopping cart that held only a couple of small items, because people came and went constantly and there was no reason to pay attention to any particular person. However, after a moment, I began to feel that uncomfortable sensation of being stared at, the subtle awareness that someone nearby is watching you with an intensity that feels out of place in an ordinary setting. So I looked up from my phone and saw the woman standing a few feet away with her arms crossed, while examining me with a look that suggested she had already decided something about me that she did not approve of. At first, I assumed she might simply be waiting for a chair herself, which would have made sense because the waiting area existed for that exact purpose. But when I glanced at the other seats, I noticed that 2 of them were still empty, which made her continued focus on me seem confusing. Finally, she spoke in a voice that carried a sharp edge of irritation, saying, "Those chairs are for customers waiting for prescriptions." For a second, I thought she might have mistaken me for someone who had wandered into the pharmacy area just to sit down, so I calmly explained that I actually was waiting for a prescription, and that the technician had told me it would be ready in about 20 minutes. Assuming that clarification would end the conversation immediately because it addressed the only possible misunderstanding. Instead of nodding and moving on, she looked me up and down slowly as if she were evaluating my answer. And then she said something so unexpected that I honestly wondered whether I had heard her correctly. "Well, you don't look sick." The comment was delivered with complete seriousness, as though she believed it was a perfectly logical observation. And for a brief moment, I simply stared at her, because the idea that a stranger would try to determine whether someone deserved to sit in a pharmacy chair based on their appearance was so ridiculous that it felt almost surreal. I shrugged slightly and explained that plenty of prescriptions are for things that are not visible, pointing out that many people pick up medication for allergies, blood pressure, infections, or dozens of other conditions that cannot be recognized just by looking at them. But rather than acknowledging the obvious point, she let out a long sigh and shook her head. "This is exactly what I mean," she muttered loudly enough for several nearby customers to hear. "People abusing store services." At that point, I realized that continuing the conversation would probably accomplish nothing, because she had clearly decided she was right before even speaking to me. So I simply returned my attention to my phone while she stood there for another moment as if expecting me to stand up and apologize for something. When I didn't move, she turned and pushed her cart toward the pharmacy counter, where she began speaking with the technician in a tone that was quiet but clearly frustrated, occasionally glancing back at me while gesturing toward the chairs. The technician listened patiently and then looked over at me before responding calmly. And although I could not hear every word, it was obvious that she was explaining that customers were allowed to sit there while waiting for prescriptions, because she briefly pointed toward the empty seats and shook her head slightly as if to indicate there was no problem. Most people would have accepted that explanation and moved on with their day. But when the woman returned to the waiting area a few minutes later, her expression looked even more annoyed than before. "The pharmacy says your prescription isn't ready yet," she announced, as though she had just uncovered some major inconsistency. "Yes," I replied calmly. "That's why I'm waiting." She gave a short scoffing laugh that sounded more like disbelief than humor, and said that the chairs were meant for people who were actively being helped rather than people just sitting around. I glanced again at the two empty chairs and pointed out that nobody else needed them, adding that I would happily stand if someone elderly or injured needed the seat. But that response seemed to irritate her even more. For several seconds she simply stared at me with the tense posture of someone who was trying to decide how far they were willing to push a pointless argument. And then she abruptly reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and began tapping the screen with determined movements. At first I assumed she was writing a complaint message or maybe taking a photo to send to someone. But then I heard her speak in a clear, deliberate voice that immediately made several nearby customers look up in surprise. "Yes, I like to report someone suspicious sitting in the pharmacy waiting area." It took a moment for the words to fully sink in, because the idea that someone would call emergency services over a pharmacy chair was so absurd that my brain instinctively rejected the possibility. Yet there she was continuing to describe me to the dispatcher as a man who had been loitering and refusing to leave the waiting chair. The technician behind the counter looked just as stunned as I felt, leaning forward to tell the woman that there was no issue and that I was simply waiting for my medication. But the woman waved her off and kept talking as if she had uncovered a serious problem that required immediate police attention. The atmosphere in the pharmacy shifted instantly from quiet routine to awkward disbelief, with several customers exchanging confused looks while the pharmacist paused his work to watch the scene unfold. About 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot outside the store, the faint reflection of its flashing lights visible through the large front windows. And when the officer walked into the pharmacy area, the woman immediately pointed toward me with dramatic certainty. "That's him," she said loudly, as though she were identifying a suspect in a major investigation. The officer glanced at me, then at the row of mostly empty chairs, and then back at the woman with an expression that suggested he already suspected this was not going to be a serious matter. He calmly asked what the problem was, and the woman launched into a long explanation about how the chairs were meant for real patients, and how I had been occupying one for nearly half an hour, even though my prescription was not ready yet. At that moment, the pharmacist stepped forward from behind the counter and politely explained that I had checked in earlier and that my medication was currently being prepared, adding that the chairs were specifically placed there so customers would not have to stand while waiting. The officer listened patiently while glancing at the computer screen behind the counter, where my name appeared on the list of prescriptions being filled, and then he turned back to the woman and explained in a calm but slightly tired tone that sitting in a pharmacy waiting chair while waiting for medication was not illegal. For a moment she looked genuinely shocked, as though the possibility that she might be mistaken had never crossed her mind. And when she tried to argue that the chairs were being misused, the officer simply gestured toward the empty seats and asked whether anyone else had been unable to sit down because of me. The answer, of course, was no. Just a few seconds later, the technician called my name and handed me the small paper bag containing my prescription. And as I thanked her and stood up, the officer gave me a quick apologetic nod before turning back to remind the woman that emergency services were meant for real emergencies, rather than personal disagreements about store seating. Walking out of the pharmacy with the bag in my hand, I could not help shaking my head at how absurd the entire situation had been, because what should have been a completely forgettable errand had somehow turned into a police call over a plastic chair that the store itself had provided for customers exactly like me who were simply waiting for their prescriptions to be ready.